In 2007, Jerry McCann's aunt, a retired teacher named Anne McCann, picked up the phone and made a call that would effectively draw a line through her name in the family ledger. She didn't call the police with a piece of damning evidence, nor an investigator with a secret lead. She called a journalist, and what she offered wasn't an accusation, but something far more dangerous: a doubt. This single act of doubt illuminates a truth we all feel but rarely admit. A family's cruelest weapon is not the heated argument, but the chilling silence. It's the phone that stops ringing, the invitation that never arrives in the mail, the unnerving sensation of being turned into a ghost among the living, punished not for a lie, but for a truth the group cannot bear to hear. We have all felt the weight of an unspoken word, the internal debate between breaking a fragile peace and being true to our own conscience. It's the fear of being the one dissenting voice that dares to question the official story and, for that, being cast out into the cold. Anne McCann's story isn't just about Madeleine's disappearance. It's about what happens in the aftermath of a tragedy when one member of a family refuses to follow the script. This is the story of the silent war that took place behind the cameras, the sophisticated tactics used to neutralize dissent, and the devastating price paid by the one relative who dared to ask the forbidden question. The answer to what happened to her exposes the invisible mechanics that any group, perhaps even your own family, uses to ensure its secrets remain buried. To understand the courage and consequence of that phone call, we must return to the earthquake's epicenter, May 2007. The world watched as a couple of British doctors lived out every parent's worst nightmare. The narrative that formed was clear, powerful, and unified. An innocent family, victims of a monstrous act. The Portuguese police were painted as incompetent, and the British media, led by ferocious tabloids, constructed a fortress of sympathy around the couple. The family closed ranks, a tight, impenetrable circle. Jerry's sister, Trish Cameron, became the public face of their unity, a loyal and articulate defender. The message was singular and absolute. We are together, we believe them, and anyone who doubts us is an enemy. So the question that haunts this chapter of the story is not just what Anne McCann said, but something much deeper and more uncomfortable. What could a retired teacher, a woman from within the heart of the family, have seen or felt in the official version of events that was so fundamentally wrong it compelled her to risk everything: her family's love, her peace of mind, her reputation, to break the world's most heavily guarded code of silence? The inciting incident wasn't a shout, but a whisper that echoed like thunder. In interviews with newspapers like the News of the World, Anne McCann didn't accuse her nephew of a crime. She did something far more subtle and, for the McCanns' PR machine, far more dangerous. She humanized doubt. She described the couple's behavior as strange. She questioned Jerry's apparent lack of public emotion. "If it were my child," she reportedly said, "I would be in pieces." These were simple, domestic words, but coming not from a stranger on the internet, but from the heart of the family itself, they were incendiary. The conflict was immediate and brutal. On one side, you had the official narrative, now professionally managed by Clarence Mitchell, a former communications director for the British government and an expert in damage control. His strategy was crystal clear: present a united, monolithic front. Any dissenting voice, no matter how small, was an existential threat to the couple's credibility. On the other side was a 61-year-old woman with no media experience, armed only with her intuition and her conscience. What was at stake was not just the McCanns' public image, it was the very definition of loyalty. The family, under the immense pressure of groupthink, where the need for cohesion overrides a rational look at reality, saw Anne not as a concerned relative, but as a traitor, a faulty part in their defense mechanism. Anne's internal conflict must have been devastating. How do you remain loyal to your conscience without committing the unforgivable sin of betraying your own blood? She was trapped between the truth as she felt it and the unspoken family code. We protect our own, no matter what. With every interview, every quoted word, she moved further away from the warm, firelit house of the family and walked deeper into the cold of ostracism, not yet knowing just how freezing that cold could become. The McCann PR machine counterattacked with surgical precision. Anne's first obstacle wasn't a physical threat, but something far more effective: invalidation. The narrative was subtly shifted. Anne was no longer a concerned aunt. She was a troubled figure. Anonymous sources began to conveniently leak stories to the press, painting a portrait of her as someone distant, perhaps with personal problems, someone seeking attention or even revenge for old family squabbles. They didn't attack her message. They systematically destroyed the messenger's credibility. At the same time, the figure of Trish Cameron, the good relative, was elevated. She was presented as Anne's antithesis: loyal, appropriately emotional, and always perfectly aligned with the official narrative. The media was fed this simple dichotomy: the bad aunt versus the good sister. It was a classic scapegoating strategy. For the family to remain pure, someone had to be chosen to carry the shadow of doubt, suspicion, and betrayal. Anne McCann became the family's emotional dumping ground. The second obstacle was a progressive, creeping silence. The calls from relatives started going unanswered. Family members who might have once been sympathetic now kept their distance. The threat wasn't a voice on the phone. It was the absence of one. It was the invisible hand of ostracism landing on her shoulder. A constant, heavy weight, whispering, "You are alone now." As the playwright Ibsen wrote, "The strongest man in the world is he who stands most alone." Anne was about to discover her own strength, but also the terrible price of that isolation. She was becoming a modern-day Cassandra, cursed with a truth no one around her wanted to hear, and punished for daring to speak it. The point of no return wasn't a single interview, but their slow accumulation. Anne's voice, once a whisper, was becoming a dangerous background noise to the McCann campaign. The seed of doubt she had planted was beginning to take root in the public's mind. Comments on online forums echoed her sentiment. If even his own aunt doesn't believe them. Her dissent was validating a growing public suspicion. The control machine had to act definitively. And then it happened. It wasn't a public confrontation or a messy argument. It was a silent disappearance. After a final series of controversial statements, Anne McCann vanished completely from the public sphere. The flow of interviews stopped. The headlines disappeared. The silence that followed was more deafening than any statement she had ever made. The press, which had once hounded her for a quote, now ignored her. The family, which had once attacked her through anonymous sources, now acted as if she had never existed. She was, in effect, erased. This is the moment the analogy of a dam becomes chillingly real. The family's silence was a dam holding back a flood of uncomfortable questions. Anne wasn't just poking a hole in it. She was threatening to shatter the entire structure. The reaction wasn't to patch the hole, but to reinforce the dam and remove anyone standing nearby with a sledgehammer. She was made into an example, a stark lesson for any other family member who might consider speaking out of turn. The message was clear. Loyalty is not a choice. It is a requirement. And the punishment for disloyalty isn't a fight. It's oblivion. But what exactly happened behind the scenes to force this absolute total silence? The story we were told is that she simply decided to stop talking. The truth, however, may be far more complex and reveals the nature of the threat that loomed over her. A threat that left no physical marks, but broke something much deeper. The force that silenced Anne McCann didn't come in the form of a henchman or an anonymous letter. It came through an act of familial power, executed with the coldness of a corporate strategy. The family, realizing that media attacks were not enough, moved the final piece on the board. It wasn't an attack, it was a peace offering, but one delivered with the weight of an ultimatum, a velvet glove over an iron fist. A senior family member, acting as an emissary for the United Front, was sent to meet with Anne. There were no shouts, no accusations. The conversation was reportedly calm, almost loving. They spoke of everyone's shared pain, of the crucial need for unity in a time of overwhelming crisis. And then, the proposal was laid on the table. It was brutally simple. Her silence in exchange for her reinstatement. She would be welcomed back into the fold. The phone calls would resume. The invitations would reappear in her mailbox. The torn family photograph would be metaphorically taped back together. All she had to do was stop. Stop talking to the press. Stop expressing her doubts. Stop being the person her conscience compelled her to be. But there was a second part to the offer. The part that was left unspoken but was perfectly, chillingly understood. If she refused, the door would not just remain closed, it would be sealed forever. The ostracism, which until then had been a subtle, creeping punishment, would become official family policy. She wouldn't just be ignored. She would be actively excommunicated, turned into a permanent pariah. The choice was stark: betray her conscience and belong, or be true to herself and be condemned to a perpetual, lonely winter. This was the climax, the real threat. It wasn't about physical violence. It was about psychological annihilation. As Edward Snowden once said, sometimes to be true to your conscience, you have to betray your institution. For Anne, the institution was her own family, and that institution was demanding her soul in exchange for a seat at the table. She chose silence. And just like that, her voice vanished. The machine had won. The family's united front remained intact, and Anne's story was relegated to a forgotten footnote. A curious mind might end the story there, with a victory for the system. But something about it is deeply haunting. The ease with which a person can be erased. The quiet efficiency with which a group can rewrite its own history simply by agreeing to forget. It makes you wonder, how many other voices in how many other families have been silenced in precisely the same way? When a family cannot bear the weight of its own darkness, it looks for someone else to carry it. The relative who speaks out becomes the vessel for the group's unspoken fears. All the doubts, all the guilt, all the shame they cannot admit are projected onto them. They call that person a traitor because it's far easier than looking in the mirror and seeing a flicker of that same truth in their own faces. This mechanism has a name. It's scapegoating. It's how a sick system pretends to be healthy, by amputating the very part that dares to point out the disease. Anne wasn't just silenced. She was made into the symbol of everything the family feared within itself. Her punishment, ostracism, is humanity's oldest and most powerful weapon. Long before prisons and laws, the ultimate punishment for breaking the clan's rules was expulsion. To be left alone, outside the firelight, was a death sentence. Today, the death is not physical, but it is a social death. It's being turned into a ghost. They don't need to threaten you with words. They can undo you with their absence. Anne's silence, therefore, was not a surrender. It was the inevitable consequence of a lost battle. She fought, and the cost of that fight was being removed from the board entirely. The PR machine, led by Clarence Mitchell, could then declare victory. The narrative was safe, but that safety was built upon the ruins of one woman's conscience. Her story holds up a mirror to a universal truth. Loyalty to the group is often just a mask for our deep-seated fear of loneliness. And the price of truth, in many cases, is not freedom, it's isolation. But one question remains, hanging in the very silence they created. By forcing her to be quiet, did they really win? Or did they just prove that there was, in fact, something to hide? The question left hanging, whether Anne's forced silence proved there was something to hide, was never officially answered. The conflict's resolution didn't come with a confession or an acquittal. It came with the passage of time. Time, which buries secrets and erodes memories, was the control machine's final, most effective tool. Anne McCann, it seems, held up her end of the bargain. She disappeared. She bought back her peace at the cost of her voice. Her character arc was not one of assent, but of forced submission. She wasn't defeated in her argument. She was simply overcome by exhaustion and isolation. She became the rejected prophet, the Cassandra who, tired of shouting to deaf ears, chose to live in silence among the ruins of her own prediction. The family, in turn, got what it wanted: absolute control of the narrative. The united front, though perhaps cracked beneath the surface, was maintained for the outside world. The torn photograph was never taped back together. The two halves were simply stored in separate drawers, in different houses, in different worlds. The resolution, therefore, is a bitter one. There are no winners here. There are only survivors, each carrying the scars of a war that was never publicly declared. Remember the call she made, the anchor that started our story? That single act, which seemed to be the beginning of a revolution, was in fact the beginning of her own erasure. The call didn't tear the veil for the world. It tore her own life in two, the part that belonged to the family and the part that belonged to her conscience, and she was forced to choose one. Her story proves George Orwell's terrible maxim. In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. But her story also adds a grim addendum. Not every revolution is victorious. So what is the great lesson here? What does the story of the McCanns' forgotten aunt really teach us? The central message isn't about guilt or innocence in a criminal case. It's about power, the invisible power that groups, be they families, companies, or nations, wield over the individual. Anne's story is an instruction manual on how to silence dissent. First, isolate the target. Second, destroy their credibility. Third, offer them a way out. Submission in exchange for peace. It's a strategy as subtle as it is devastating because it turns the victim into an accomplice in their own silencing. And this makes me think about our own lives, about the times we've swallowed a truth to avoid a conflict at the dinner table, the times we've seen something wrong at work, but calculated the risk of speaking up and chose the safety of silence. Aren't we all, at some point, faced with Anne's choice, the choice between integrity and belonging? Her story leaves us with an uncomfortable truth. Moral courage is often rewarded not with applause, but with the cold of isolation. And perhaps the true test of character isn't having the strength to speak, but having the resilience to endure the consequences when no one else wants to listen. The question, in the end, is not what happened to Madeleine McCann. It's what happened to the truth, and what we are willing to sacrifice for it. My final opinion after diving into this story is that Anne McCann was not a traitor. She was the family's conscience. And the real tragedy is not that she was silenced. It's that the family chose to amputate its own conscience to be able to live with its ghosts. They didn't punish her for lying. They punished her for reflecting a truth they couldn't bear to see in their own eyes. And that is a wound that no PR strategy can ever heal. And now, after all of this, I truly want to know what this story has stirred in you. The question I leave you with is the same one she must have asked herself. What is the price of your peace? Write it in the comments below. It can be just one line, but let it be real. I will read every single one because your voice matters, so that no courageous voice is ever forgotten. If this story has touched you, know that it is just the tip of the iceberg. The war for control of the McCann narrative had another soldier, an even more powerful and enigmatic figure, the guardian of silence, Clarence Mitchell. In our next video, we will investigate the man hired to build the wall and the tactics he used to ensure no one could tear it down. It's the other half of the torn photograph. To not miss this follow-up, subscribe to the channel. Be part of this space where we seek the truth that hides behind the official story. Every subscription is a vote of confidence that these stories need to be told. Thank you for staying until the end. Until the next investigation.